My name is Clare Lehane, and I'm a publisher with Elsevier on the Energy and Nuclear Science portfolio. I'm based in Oxford in the UK, and today I'm just going to talk for about an hour on journal publishing and scholarly publishing and some hints and tips that might be useful for you when you come to start writing. Now, some of you, I can see about maybe 4 or 5 of you in the audience have probably written a good many papers, but this is mainly geared towards people who are doing their master's, their PhD, who are starting to write their paper and maybe need a little bit of guidance. When I started doing my PhD, when I started writing my papers, I didn't have much guidance. I was basically copying what was done before, and that's not necessarily the best way to start a scientific career. So I'm just going to go very broad in the beginning and talk about the journal landscape, and then come down into specific how you go about writing your paper. So just before I start, can everybody understand me? I'm not going too fast or too slow? Too fast? It's okay, right? You can okay, brilliant, okay. So every year, there's about 3 million articles submitted across all disciplines. About 50% of those are published, which means 50% are rejected. For example, in the energy sphere, the rejection rate is about 70%. If you submit a paper to the big journals like Nature or Science or Cell, you're looking at a rejection rate of about 95%. In energy engineering, you're talking maybe about 50%. It depends across the board. It depends what discipline you're going to be submitting your paper to. There's about 30 million readers, 2 billion article downloads, and 30 million article citations. That's a very, very big area to be working in. But always remember that when you come to write your paper and you get your science out to the community, your community would be much smaller. But be aware that as soon as something gets online, is published on the Web of Science, is published on Science Direct, somebody somewhere is going to be reading it. And your task as a researcher is to make sure that people understand your research in the best possible way, that your job is to make it easy for them to understand what you're talking about. And if you can do that, people will tend to cite and download your articles more than they would articles that they really don't understand. And that's how you start your career. This is your currency. Papers are your currency. So every couple of years, Nature, the journal, has a look at various parts of the world and kind of groups them together and sees how they're doing against each other. And last year, they had a look at Asia Pacific. And the only thing I want you to have a look at is South Korea, because that's the most interesting part, right? In general, South Korea, it's a really good place to come out of university. It's a really good place to publish papers on. If you take the whole of the Asia Pacific, South Korea punches above its weight in the physical sciences. Now, all that means is that if you're from a South Korean university and you're publishing in a physical sciences area, people will look at your paper and they'll expect a certain level of expertise from that paper. Now, you can see that China has a huge amount of papers. That's fine. There's a huge amount of people in China. But in terms of what every single South Korean author puts into their paper in physical sciences, South Korean authors are above average. South Korean authors are also above average in another way. You can see that, I'm going to move. You can see that that green line represents South Korea, and that is the funding over time. So your government is pumping funding into science to make sure that there is enough background funding so that you can do the science you want. You can see that trajectory is huge. It's bigger than China. So you have a lot of ability, and you have a lot of funding to do really good research. And the second thing you look at here is down here, is researcher density. So because you have a lot of funding, you also have a lot of researchers. So what that means in general is that when people see an affiliation from a South Korean university, they expect a certain level of expertise from you. So always bear that in mind when you're writing your papers. If you're putting down South Korean university, people expect good things from you. So this is the output of your university. Don't worry about 2015 because 2015 isn't over yet. Just look at 2014. So basically, in terms of number of papers published, every year your university is publishing more and more papers. That's a really good sign of a university that's doing very well. And that will feed back the fact that you get more funding, there are more researchers in South Korea as a whole compared to the rest of Asia Pacific. So again, you are publishing more papers. The papers that you're publishing then need to feed into this general area of excellence that people expect when they read a paper with a South Korean university affiliation. So in the areas you tend to publish, your university tends to publish, mostly it's in the medicine side of things, but you can see that you have physical sciences, chemistry, material science. So you've got a nice broad range of subjects that you publish in, but because of your background, you do most of your publishing in medicine. And you have a nice lot of international collaboration with other universities. Most of it's in Asia Pacific, but you've got a nice bunch of people in Europe and a nice bunch of people in North Korea. And remember, the more international people that you can get to collaborate with, that you can get to put on your papers, the better. Because it has been found that if you have a range of people from a range of geographical locations, people tend to cite your paper a little bit more. Okay, so that's your general framework of South Korea, your own university, so where you live in the world. Basically, in terms of universities, you're at a very good university. People expect a certain level of expertise when they see your university on your author affiliation. So the first big question of the day is, why do people publish? And since the very first journal came out in the UK, there's 4 reasons why people publish. The first one is registration. People want to say, I did this. They put their flag on the mountain and say, I did this. The second one is quality assurance. Okay, you've done a piece of research, but you need to know what the community think about it. So that's where the peer review process comes in. Then dissemination globally. It's all very well just slapping something up on the internet on your personal website, but you need to get it out to your community. This is how you build your currency. This is how you make sure that people are aware of your research. And the last one is archiving and perpetuity. You want to be able to make sure that people can get your paper time after time after time again, which is where databases like the Web of Science and Scopus come in, and Science Direct. That once you publish your paper, that link, that hyperlink to that paper is always persistent. So the second big question that you should ask yourself, and this is a really hard question to answer, is, are you ready to publish? So when you do your master's or your PhD, or even your 4th year project, you generate a lot of data, months and months and years of data. And it's your first job is to critically look at that data and say, well, do I have enough in here to tell a good story? And that's all journal writing is. It's telling a good enough story that your research gets out there in a good way to people. So you have to be kind of like a detective in your own work. Pick out the best part of your data and then publish. Sometimes you might get to 6 months and you say, yeah, I've got really good results. But then ask yourself, would it be better if I waited 2 or 3 more months and got more data? And usually the more data you have, the better your story is. So it's a good question to ask yourself before you start writing anything at all. But if you think you say, yes, I think I can have enough to publish, you're looking to present new results, you're looking to rationalize or refine published results, or to review and summarize a field. So when you're starting out, this is the one that you want to be talking about, because you want to get your name out there with new results. Once you start building your career, then the second 2 become more important. And usually it's, full professors tend to do review papers. So when you're starting out, if you can say, yes, I have something new, it hasn't been published before, I think it's of use to the community, then go at 1. Then you're ready to publish. So you need a good vehicle for your research. And the first and most important thing is that you need to have a clear and useful message. It's all very well knowing your research, but unless you can push it out there to your community so they can make use of that research, it's not much use. It has to be presented in a logical manner. People read in different ways, but they are conditioned almost to read scientific literature in a certain way. And they want to get to your research. They want to know what you're doing. And writing in a logical manner helps people find your story. And this is what will help readers grasp your research, if you can do it in a logical manner. So the types of manuscripts are full articles, letters of short communications, or review papers. And when you're starting out, you tend to stick with full articles because then you can get a coherent bit of research out there. It's long enough so you can get everything in there, but it's not a thesis chapter, it's not your PhD thesis. So, you know, it's enough for people to read in half an hour. So once you've decided that you do have enough data to publish something, the next thing you need to really look at is where to submit your paper, because there are very, very many journals out there. You all have a vague idea of the journals that you want to publish in because you've done your literature review. You know the journals that keep coming up time after time after time. But in case you're kind of new to this, the main things that people look to is the reputation of the journal, the relevance to my discipline, the quality of the peer review, and the impact factor. And for me, the most important one of those is these two, the relevance of my, to the discipline and the quality of the peer review. Sometimes you see people trying to get their papers published in maybe the highest impact factor journal they can. Sometimes the very high impact factor journals like Nature and Science have a very general audience. So they're looking for a very different type of paper. But if you're, say, a mechanical engineer and you've been working on a piece of kit and you've come up with a really, really good solution to a problem, you don't necessarily want that to go into a really broad journal. You want to talk to your community. So sometimes there's a journal, maybe a lower impact factor, perfectly normal journal that is the best one for you. So you do have to critically analyze where you want your article to go. Don't be blinded by the impact factors. The impact factors are fine and you can use them as a guide, but always look for the quality of the peer review and the relevant to your discipline. Because remember, when you write your paper, you're trying to engage with the community. And if you have a very specific community that you want to engage with, and they have a very specific journal, it's better to kind of go to that journal rather than go to a really broad community and some of your people mightn't see it. So this is some of the checklist that you can go through when choosing the right journal. Have a look at your references, look at the recent publications, and if the same journals keep on popping up, it's a good bet you should be targeting those journals. Is the journal peer-reviewed? It always should be peer-reviewed. Who's the audience? Average time to publication is important if you're on a deadline. The journal's impact factor, you can take that into account. What kind of publication is it? Is it open access? Is it a hybrid journal? Is it a subscription journal? But whatever you do, choose one journal and submit to that journal. Don't try to play the system and submit the same paper to 5 different journals, because that rarely ends very well from everybody. And at the end of my talk, I'll have a chat about multiple submissions. And then have a look at the guidelines for the journal, just to make sure that there's nothing in there that would preclude it from you submitting it to them. So everybody has heard about the impact factor. And the impact factor is basically the number of citations articles get in that journal. It happens over 2 years, and it comes out in June or July every year. The impact factor is just one metric that you can use when you're searching to submit your paper to a journal. Don't live and die by the impact factor. It's an average number, and sometimes if a journal is very small, like maybe publishes 40 or 50 papers a year, or it's only in year 4, year 5, but actually it's really good for you, the impact factor might fluctuate because the papers are really small. The numbers of papers are really, really small. And again, it's just a 2-year window, and sometimes that window is quite restrictive. So absolutely look at the impact factor, but also look at the other things like community and peer review in association with the impact factor. Now, when you start writing your journal, your papers, be aware that you are writing your papers for yourself, of course. These are your currency. But the people that will help you build your career are the people that read your papers. So you must always be aware of your readers. Make life as easy as possible for them. Now, we've all read papers that have been very, very boring. And we've got to the second page and we've like, oh, I can't do this anymore. My eyes are bleeding. You want to avoid that. Always bear in mind that when somebody makes the decision to read your paper, they have given you 30 minutes to read your paper. So you've got to catch them in straight away and keep them going for that 30 minutes. So don't try to crowbar everything into one paper. There'll be loads of time to publish many, many papers. But bear in mind that reading a scientific paper can sometimes be difficult, and it's your job as scientists to make that as easy as possible for your readers. Okay, so there's a definite way of constructing your article when you come around to it. And this is kind of, you can put this on your thesis as well when you come to publish it. So basically you have your title, abstracts, and keywords, and all they make it easy for search engines like Google Scholar to crawl your paper and to pull back exactly what the paper means. Then you have your main text, which is your introduction, materials, and methods. So this is the main body of your text. And then you have your conclusions and references and so on and so forth. So in this main text here, be aware of your audience again. Be aware that that 30 minutes that the reader has to read your paper. Mostly everything is online now, so there shouldn't be any word constrictions, but don't try to put everything into your paper. Make it as concise as possible. So in general, when you start a paper, it's like introduction, which is very general, then it goes really specific into your area, and it comes out very general indeed to the discussion. However, when you start writing your paper, you don't start with your introduction, so you don't write it in a linear fashion. You start at what you know, and you know your figures and your tables. You know your method, your results. Then you can write your discussion. Then your conclusions and introductions, and finally your abstracts and title. Now that seems a bit weird because it's always good to start with your title, right? Absolutely, give yourself a proof title and go with that. But when you're writing your paper, sometimes it happens that you're sitting there and you're writing and you have a better idea, and then you need to rejig your title, you need to rejig your abstract as you go writing, which is why have a proof title to start with, but always draft and redraft your title and abstract, for the following reasons. So your title. So remember that this is the first value proposition your readers will make about you. Now remember, your readers don't know who you are, they just know you go to this university and you've written a paper on something. They're not your supervisors, they're not your friends. So the first value judgment they make on you is how you write your title. And if they're interested in the title, they'll probably look at the abstract, they'll probably download the paper. So a title is really, really important. Few as possible words, it must describe the content, which is self-explanatory, identify the main issues, and don't stick in abbreviations that are not widely used. Okay, if you work on DNA, use DNA, but try and keep abbreviations out of the title. Now, my background is not in nuclear engineering and design, but I have a fairly good idea of what that title means. So always give your title to somebody else once you're finished with it and say, what does this mean to you? And if your colleague says, it means X to me, and you said, yes, exactly, that's what my paper is about, excellent. But if they turn around and say, I think it means Y, then you might have a problem. And that's why always, before you go anywhere near a journal, rejig your title. So these are some titles that needed work. The first one is too long. Again, remember your 30 minutes. You want to get people in. The second one isn't specific enough. It could mean anything to a number of people. And the third one doesn't make any sense at all. Remember that you know your data very well. You know your research very well. But no one else is living in your head. So you need to be able to make sure that people understand what you're talking about, which is always good to give your paper to someone else to peer review before it goes near a journal. Your abstract is your elevator pitch. It's 250 to 350 words that adequately and accurately describe your paper. This is why you should write your abstract at the end, because once you finish your discussion, your results, your materials and methods, you know what you're talking about, and you can synthesize your article into 300 words. It is important because it's the second value judgment people make about you when they read your paper. And sometimes it's the only thing they can see. Maybe the paper isn't available, and they will have to make a decision whether or not they want to contact you to get a proof of your paper. So spend a lot of time on your abstract. It is very important. Keywords are just tags to your paper. And they're what like Google Scholar and Web of Science and Scopus will use to make sure that your paper is categorized in the right area. They're not a big deal, but if a journal asks you for keywords and they say, I want 6 keywords, give them 6 keywords. Because if you forget keywords, sometimes the processing editor on the journal will send your paper back to you and say you haven't completed everything, and that just builds in extra time into your review process that you could have done without. So, your introduction. The main thing to remember about your introduction is that it is not your literature review. So when you're doing your research, you read tons and tons of paper, and you could write a whole thesis on the literature that is available in your field. People don't want to know that. All they want to know is that you know enough to put the problem that you're looking at into context into their field. Have a look at the journal that you want to publish in and see how long their introduction is. And if their introduction is just 400 words, make your introduction 400 words. People do read the introduction, but not with the same ferocity as they read the materials and methods, the results, and the discussion. You don't have to crowbar 100 references into your introduction either. Just set the scene for the people. And that basically is what's the main limitation and what you hope to achieve. So the methods, so these are kind of like the ingredients to your cake. So it does include detailed information. You don't have to describe previously published material, you just cite it and identify the equipment and describe the materials used. Now that point is very important because what you want to make very sure of happening is if somebody who was in a similarly kitted out lab with the same background as you tried to replicate your results using the materials and methods that you've laid out in their paper, they should be able to do that. If they're not able to do that using the materials and methods that you've put on the paper, and they've done it many, many times, and they still can't figure out where you're getting your results, that kind of brings in an area of uncertainty into people's minds. Like, well, I've done exactly what this person has said in the materials and methods, and I can't get their results. And sometimes people around in different labs around the world, they will try to replicate your results because they might be very, very interesting. And the more people who can't replicate your results based on what you've written, the more kind of uncertainty builds up, and it kind of creeps up and creeps up. And people say, well, if 6 different labs can't do what you've done, what did you actually do? Have you forgotten something? Are you hiding something? So it kind of builds into a situation that you really don't want to be associated with. So make sure when you do your materials and methods that somebody in a lab in, I don't know, the States could also replicate your materials and methods. So results. So basically, this is your cake. What have you found? Now, bear in mind your readers again, they've got the 90 minutes. They will spend they've got the 30 minutes. They will spend a good amount of that 30 minutes reading your results. So you want to pump a lot of effort into this area. They should include the main findings, any stats results, and present only the results that you're going to talk about in discussion. And this brings us back again to the amount of data that you're all going to generate in your 3 or 4 years. You'll have a ton of data. Basically, your cloud will be full. But not every single one of your results will be of equal status. Some of those results will be much better than the others, and those are the results that you want to put into your paper. You won't be able to put every single result into your paper because A, it won't be interesting, it will be a really difficult story to tell, and it'll be miles too long. That's what your thesis is for. When you write your paper, pick out the 1 or 2 or 3 data points that tell a good story and just talk about them. In the future, if you have time to go back to the other stuff, fair, so be it. But always, when you come to write a paper, pick your best results. Be aware that if you have like big tables of stats or computer code, you don't have to try and put them into results. You can put them into supplementary data, and they'll be hosted online. So if someone is really interested in the 25-page table that you generated, they can have a look at that in the supplementary material, and that doesn't take away from your paper at all. Back to your readers and their eyeballs. When people read a lot of text, it makes their eyes quite sore and they get a bit bored. So always make sure that you have something else for them to look at in tables or figures. But if you do put a lot of tables and figures into your results, make sure that they make sense to be in there. Make sure the tables are short and succinct and make sense. Make sure that if you have scales, that you put them in there. Don't mess around too much with color. And make sure that everything kind of makes sense. And this is really hard to do because, again, you live in this data. So when I was doing my PhD, I was doing my PhD on something that not a lot of people were doing it on. So there was like 2 people in the world, me and some other people in South America were doing it. So I found it very difficult to visualize my data because I had nothing to go from. So I was reading around and I found this awesome table that it was going to be perfect. So I kind of copied the structure and put in my own data. And I was like, yeah, perfect. And then stuck it into my thesis and forgot about it. And on the day of my viva, of my defense, so I sat down next to the lady who was going to give me a PhD or not give me a PhD. And she opened the thesis onto the page of that table. And she was like, Claire, explain this to me. And then I hadn't seen this table for a while. And I was looking at it and I was going, I can't. This table makes no sense to me whatsoever. And it was my table because I didn't think about how it looks to other people. I just rushed in to try to graph out my work and it made no sense. And she was like, well, this isn't the best start, but let's see if you can kind of pull it back. And at the end, you know, she gave me my PhD and I'm very grateful for her. But the thing is, you don't want to be in that situation in the peer review process because in that situation, my supervisor was there. They knew that I was a reasonably decent student. When you go out to peer review, they don't know who you are. They just know your name, your university, and that you've written a paper with a lot of incomprehensible tables on it. So be aware of how you present your data. This is not great. I mean, it's a lot of medical stuff, but around here, I'm like, meh, I can't be bothered. That would be much better displayed as a table or a figure. This table is pointless. It's just a space filler. You can get that table done into a couple of sentences, and then you can use the space that would have been previously taken up with that table for something that was actually a bit more interesting. What am I supposed to be looking at? Where are my eyes? Are they on the line graphs? Are they on the bar graphs? Are they on the kind of the things underneath it? This makes more sense. So even though you're rushing to get things published, take time as to how you want to graph out your data. Because remember your community, remember your reader. You want to make things easy for them to understand. So discussion. So discussion is where your personality comes out to a certain degree. This is when you get to say, I did this, I found this, and this is how it's going to make science go forward in my area. It's the most important section. It's what people tend to skip to. So they read your title, they read your abstract, and then they probably go to your discussion. And if they're really interested, they'll go back to your materials and methods and results. So make your discussion correspond to your results. And this again, remember when I said earlier that you have a lot of results and you want to make sure that only the results that tell a really good story get put into the discussion, which is true. But sometimes what happens, you see it a lot, somebody will drop in a result into the discussion and the editor will be like, I can't see this in the results anywhere. And then they'll come back and query it and you have to defend it. So always make sure that everything you stick in your discussion, you can defend it and you can show it in your results section. And you need to compare published results with yours. Now this is fine when your published results kind of collaborate or corroborate what's already been discussed, as in like, I found X, someone in Japan also found X, great, we have something has worked here. But sometimes your results will be in direct contradiction with someone else's. That's absolutely fine, but you need to show the editors, you need to show the community that you stand behind your results and you compare and contrast the two. If you leave out a study that conflicts with your study, you can be guaranteed that the editors know of that study and the reviewers know of that study, and they'll put back in their review notes to you saying, why didn't you talk about, I don't know, Zhang et al. Said X, Y, and Z, and you're saying ABC. You need to talk about that stuff. And it's absolutely fine. I mean, for all anybody knows, you could have been right and Zhang could have been wrong. Conclusion. So this is kind of like your business card to the community. It should be clear, it justifies your work in the research field and it suggests future experiments. Don't spend too much time on the conclusion, but it is just like a business card. It just says, I've done this work, I'm probably going to do more work in it. If you're interested, do contact me. It's very subliminal. References. References are a pain in the head unless you have a reference manager tool. And there's tons of them online like EndNote or Mendeley. But basically, You just need to cite the main scientific publications on which your work is based. So everybody has read a ton, you've read a lot of books, you've read a lot of journals. You don't all have to put them into your paper. Always make sure that you fully absorb the material that you're citing. Sometimes, especially in the introductions, you can see someone has written a sentence, and after the sentence, there's like 10 references. Now, I can almost guarantee that those 10 references didn't say that sentence. It's a copy and paste job from numerous papers. It looked like a nice way to start your introduction. The problem with that is that if something's been copied and copied and copied, and you haven't read it, you haven't read those 10 references, there could be something in those references that absolutely contradict what you've just said. It's just nobody has checked. And sometimes your references, your referees, the people who are looking critically at your work, could be the authors of one of those references, and they'll pick you up on it and say, I didn't say that at all, actually. And then it brings in a little bit of kind of uneasiness into the rest of the paper. Well, if she didn't look at this, what else hasn't she looked at? Avoid excessive self-citations from yourself, which is fine when you're starting out because you don't have anything to cite, and also excessive citations from publications in the same region. Nobody works in a vacuum. There are many, many different labs in many different locations who are doing sort of the same thing as you might be doing, so cite around the place. And then conform to the guide for authors. This is painful, but editors and publishers like to make sure that you've got your references in the style of the journal. Acknowledgements is just anybody. You can cite your grant number here, your advisors, your proofreaders or suppliers. If you're going to name somebody in your acknowledgements, just check with them that they're okay with that, because some people would prefer to be anonymous. So this is what a typical paper tends to look like. It's not the same for all journals in the field, but in general, it's about 25 to 30 pages, a typeset submitted article. And you can see that most of the work goes in here, results in discussion, and then you build around it. Some journals do have word counts, mostly on the medical side, and if they ask for 3,000 words with 5 figures, give them 3,000 words with 5 figures, but make sure that most of that 3,000 words is stuck in your results and your discussion, because that's your work, and that's the work that the editor and the peer reviewer is most interested in. So a couple of things you want to pay attention to when you're writing your paper before it gets submitted, before it goes anywhere near a journal. You want to make sure that you know who the first author is and who all the other authors are. So the first author is basically the person who conducts, who supervises, who does the analysis, who writes the paper, who submits it to the journal. This is the person that answers all the queries and defends the paper if needs be. Any other author makes intellectual contributions to the data analysis, looks at every paper draft, and is able to defend that paper if needs be. Things you want to avoid are ghost authorship and gift authorship. Ghost authorship is leaving authors out who should be on the paper. And sometimes this happens when PhDs leave one university and they go to work as a postdoc in another university. Their work still continues at their first university, but because they're not there, people may forget to put them on as an author. They publish the paper, and the paper gets published without the postdoc's name. The problem with that is that the postdoc is probably working in the same field still, and he probably has like alerts from the journal, and he will get an alert when this paper is published, and he will say, oh, it's the guys from wherever university. This is the stuff we were working on, right? It's like, well, I didn't know anything about it. Why isn't my name on the paper? I looked at this draft. I did all the work. Why are they leaving me out? And then he emails you, he emails the dean, he emails the editor. It gets a bit complicated. The second thing you want to avoid is gift authorship. And this sometimes happens, say, you're at a conference, and you're in the middle of writing your paper, and you talk to somebody who's given you a really good idea, and they've steered you in a direction that you never thought about before. And it's given you, it's helping you write your paper. So you write your paper, and at the end you stick them on, and you don't tell them because you think it's a nice surprise for them. The problem with that, they're probably in the same field as you. They get the alerts, and they see their name on a paper that they cannot defend. They've never seen the paper before. They have no idea. They can't even remember who you are half the time. And they're supposed to be an author in this paper. And again, they'll email you. They'll email your dean. They'll email the journal editor. and they'll want off the paper. Once a paper is published online, it has to stay online as it is, unless there are severe issues with that paper. And we're talking as in like medical dosage are wrong. It could libel people, or it could detrimentally affect their health. If something is missing an author, or there's too many authors on it, that paper stays there, and then an erratum or a corrigendum is produced and linked to that journal and linked to that paper. So no paper can just change once it's published. It stays in the way it's been submitted and accepted by the journal. Have a think about conflicts of interest. All you need to think about here is that if you think you have a conflict of interest, for example, you've been working on a piece of kit and your father owns shares in the piece of kit company, then that may be a conflict of interest. So all you have to do in the letter to the editor, say what type of conflict you believe you might have, and then it's up to the editor to see if there is an actual conflict. But the most important thing is to declare it at submission, and then you can work it out before anything gets published. So language does make a difference. So the language of science, for better or for worse, is English, and the writing of the scientific paper is in English. Now, I lived in Germany for a good many years, and I was able to have a chat with my colleagues in German, but I could not write a scientific paper in German to save my life. I didn't have the skills. I'm massively impressed that I'm walking around talking fairly fast, and everybody here is nodding in the places they should be nodding. So, you know, I'm in awe of everybody here who has English as a second language, because sometimes I struggle with English as my first language. But you do need to make sure that when you write in a clean, fluid style, and you use correct English. Because think of your community, think of your reader. They don't want to have to struggle past your English to get to the science. They don't care about how you write your English. They just want to know about your science. So you, as well as constructing your article in a logical fashion, you need to be able to construct it using decent and specific English. And in general, write direct and short sentences, only put one idea in a sentence, and avoid multiple statements in one sentence, like this. This is one sentence. You know, here, I'm like, no, I want to stop reading now because it doesn't make any sense. It might make sense to the reader because they're really into it, but that makes more sense. So with regards to checking your English, and I used to do this all the time because I have a habit of talking a lot and writing a lot, and I'd get everything, I'd be pages and pages into an introduction that wasn't very interesting to anybody but me. So before it went anywhere near my supervisor or into a journal, I would give my paper to my lab partner, and I'd give her a box of chocolates or something and say, please can you check this for English language to make sure that I'm making sense. And usually it would come back and she'd have track changes everything because it didn't make sense to her. And if it didn't make sense to her, who I sit next to, it's not going to make sense to the editors, it's not going to make sense to reviewers. So start your peer review as far in advance as possible, and do check your English. And it'll be painful. My supervisor used to say to me, all first drafts are crap. Don't even come near me until you're on your third or fourth draft. And this takes time. Writing a paper is an art. It takes time, and you do have to do it. You do have to draft it 6 or 7 or 8 times. And that sounds really painful and long, I know, especially if you're on a deadline. But the more you draft it, the more you craft it, the easier process it will have through the peer review process. So your covering letter is something that you submit alongside with your article, and it's your chance to speak directly to the editor. So your editor will read this before he reads your paper. Mention what makes your paper good for his or her journal, and then note any special requirements. So this is where your conflict of interest comes in, and if you think there are some people that can review your paper adequately and without any conflict, then you can put their names in here. And this is what it looks like. Also, it's good practice in a covering letter to make sure you've got final approval from all authors. So before you hit the button that says submit, make sure that all your authors know they're on the paper, that they can defend the paper, and that they're aware that you're submitting to a particular journal. So the review process. Sometimes in the past, the review process might look like a big black hole. You've made your baby, you've submitted it to this journal, who you know nobody on, and then silence for a couple of weeks. It's not that it's gone into a black hole, people are working on your paper. And in general, the peer review process tends to look like this. The paper comes into the journal. The editor or the handling editor looks to see if the basic requirements have been met. If they have been met, then it goes on to the peer reviews. They give back their opinion to the editor, and then the editor can make a decision. Sometimes, though, here, the basic requirements aren't met. So the editor can't understand what you're trying to say, it's out of scope for their journal, or there's some ethical issue. In that case, it doesn't go on to peer review, it gets put back to you with a couple of comments from the editor saying, at this stage, we won't be able to take your paper for peer review. Always have a look at those kind of feedback that the editor gives back and use it so you rejig your paper and submit it somewhere else. Be aware that there might be different types of peer review happening on your journal. So the most common type of peer review, especially on energy engineering journals, is single blind. And single blind is where the reviewers know your name, but you don't know who the reviewers are. Double blind is more common in medicine and social sciences, and it's where the reviewers just get the text of your paper. They don't know who you are, they don't know your affiliation, and you don't know who they are either. But more and more, journals are experimenting with open peer review, where the peer review report is published next to the paper when it's published. The names of the peer reviewer are also published next to the paper, so everybody knows who has done something with your paper. And sometimes your paper is received into the journal as a submission, and the journal puts your unreviewed paper up online and then invites the community to say a few words, to comment on your paper, alongside the traditional peer review process. So your journal will always say what kind of peer review it does, and in general, single blind and double blind are probably the ones you're going to come across, but it's always good to bear in mind what kind of peer review is happening, because what you don't want to do is get your paper published and then they've suddenly also published your peer review reports as well. So what do editors and reviewers look for? So be aware that when a reviewer agrees to review your paper, they spend about 4 to 6 hours. That's the median of reviewing your paper. And they're generally looking for the appropriateness to the journal. Is it within the aims and scope of the journal? The scientific soundness, the clarity, the cohesiveness, and the length of the paper. So all these things, it's good to bear in mind when you submit your paper to a journal. This is what they will be filling in. Roughly, they'll get a series of checkboxes saying, is this journal within scope? Is it written well? Is there any ethical issues? And they'll tick yes, yes, no, no. And then they'll get a free comment box so they can write the actual comments they want to the editor. When you getting peer review reports back on your paper is a bit painful. Because remember, this person may not be as expert as you are in your particular area, and they may have got the wrong end of the stick, and they may say some things that really annoy you. But remember, they don't know who you are. Well, they know who you are, but they don't know who you are. They've taken 4 to 6 hours out of usually their weekend to review and read your paper out of the goodness of their heart, basically, for the scientific good. So when they do come back to you, they may be critical. But that's the whole point. The whole point is to review your work and see how it sits, and if it can sit in the scientific literature. If they make a comment, just cut and paste that comment onto a new Word document and then answer that comment. If the peer review says you have spelt mechanical wrong all the way through your paper, then copy and paste that out and say, thank you, I have now corrected the spelling of mechanical. If they've taken the time to pick it out, you can take the time to answer the question. Sometimes though, they may not quite get what you're talking about, and they may have kind of made a little bit of a mistake into how you're trying to put something across to them. That's fine, because remember, not everybody is as expert in your field as you are. So if you feel that they've made a decision that is incorrect, or they've made a comment that you need to rebut, that's absolutely fine. Copy and paste out the comment and say, thank you very much, reviewer. I understand where you're coming from, but on this case, my views stand because X, Y, and Z. And that's absolutely fine. But make sure that you're very collegial, you're very proper, and that you're very logical in your answers. Don't get angry at reviewers. Just make sure you answer their questions in the nicest possible collegial manner, and that will be fine. Because remember, the first person who's going to see your responses is not the reviewer, it's the editor. And if the editor thinks that you have answered the reviewer's questions in a nice, logical, truthful manner, there's a chance that he or she will say, okay, that makes sense, it doesn't need to go back to peer review. So sometimes it's interesting to have a look to see what kind of comments that real journal uses. So this journal, I thought, sorry for the lots of text, but this is what might happen if your paper isn't quite yet in the state to publish. It's not quite yet in a state to go through the peer review. And it will come into the editor, and the editor will make a decision. And basically, these are the kinds of things that will stop an editor putting a paper out to peer review. So there's the whole English grammar, syntax, the quality of writing, and also it's this kind of thing here. Substantial advancement in the knowledge of the field. You want to be able to show that your work substantially advances your field. You don't want to be replicating what's always out there. So this is an example of a paper that didn't make it through peer review. So it went out to the peer reviewers, and these are the kind of comments that come back. And when a paper is rejected, these are the kind of comments that you'll tend to see over and over and over again. And it's basically the failure to provide new and interesting results. The discussion is too speculative, it's too woolly, there's nothing of substance there. There's no evidence. And again, we have the typos and the grammatical errors. Sometimes editors will look at an abstract, and if they find 3 or 4 grammatical errors, they'll send it back to the author and say, listen, I've read your abstract, your work seems absolutely fine for the journal, but right now there's too many spelling mistakes. Fix that, and we put it into peer review, which is always good, which is why it's always good to fix your English language before you go anywhere near a journal, so you don't have to build in this extra time delay. This is another example. Basically, the authors didn't do a proper lit review. They forgot half the references, or they didn't read half the references. So they went off and they thought they'd done excellent research, but actually that research had already been done before, many, many times. So before you start writing, before you start researching, before you start getting your own kind of experiments together, make sure you do a proper lit review, that you're not replicating someone else's work. And again, at the end, there is nothing new or significant from the present study. And that's what comes up time and time again. These are the things, these are the areas where papers tend to fail. And it's always around too speculative, not described enough, people can replicate it, the grammar or typos, there's too many of those. If you can avoid those 6 or 7 points, so much the better. That means that people are concentrating on the science and they're not working their way past your English. They're not working your way past really woolly materials and methods. So this is an example of a really good paper written by a student, a Korean student who is now at a German university. And I asked the editor, what made, did he have any thoughts that I could share with you as a part of this lecture? And basically, this is what he said. Don't be offended or rejected when your paper gets rejected. It happens to everybody. It happened to me more times than I care to remember. And you get really angry. You said, I've given this paper to some people and it's not good enough. I think it's good enough. And you do that for about 24 hours and then you get over it. And then you look at the reviews and you say, all right, they might have a point, I'll rejig it. But this is the scientific process. Not everything you do will be in a fit state to be put out to the community the first time. The second time, maybe. Third time, maybe. It's an iterative process. It keeps on going. And he's right. There was many, many good papers that have been rejected from one really good journal and ended up in another journal that turned out to win a lot of prizes. So I'm sure everybody here could win a prize for the paper if it was good enough. but be aware it takes a couple of times. Just don't get discouraged. You have your whole of your career to polish your writing, and this is just the start of it. So ethical issues. This is a good thing to be aware of when you start out. So the most, so the ones in blue here are the kind of the most important examples of unethical behavior. So they're fabrication of data, falsification of data, and plagiarism. And the ones in black type, they kind of fall in a gray area. And it's kind of no ethics approval, ignoring outliers, you know, the way you do your stats could be a bit unethical. I'm going to concentrate on the first three for the moment. So the thing that's most worrying to me as a publisher, because unethical behavior in all my journals I get involved in, is this results. So basically, this journal looked at 2,000 biomedical papers, and they found that 21% of the retractions were attributed to error. So that means that the author found a mistake in their paper. Either they made a mistake in their materials and methods, or they looked at their results wrong and they did something weird to their stats. And it got published, and someone pointed it out, and they went, oh gosh, okay, I've made a mistake. Please retract my paper because it's no longer true. That's fine, that's an honest mistake. The scary number is that 67% of retractions were attributed to people who had willfully, knowingly plagiarized or in some other way gone through misconduct. And that is huge. That is a big, scary number to me as a publisher. So multiple submissions. So if I didn't know anything about the journal processing environment, and I was on a deadline, I had to get 2 papers published in order to get my master's or my PhD, I would send my paper to 5 journals that are in the same area and see who won. And then, great, I've covered all my bases, I'm good. The problem with that is that when you send the same paper to multiple journals in the same field, you can be guaranteed that those editors know each other and that they're using the same pool as reviewers as each other. Because remember, there isn't an unlimited pool of reviewers, and editors tend to use the same ones as much as possible because they know they're good. And it is probable that your 2 papers will be reviewed by the same reviewers. And one reviewer will come back to the first editor and say, I've just seen this paper, the exact same paper from the same author in another journal in for review. And then the editor will maybe contact the other editor, they'll have a chat and say, I'm sorry, we can't go forward with this peer review because this is a duplicate submission. And one of them may decide to go forward with your paper as long as the other one is taken out of the submission process. But they may also decide, because they feel that you have tried to game the system, they may decide that it's best for their journal if they don't handle any papers from you at that moment in time. So basically, take-home message, don't send your paper to a second journal until you have a definite decision from the first journal. Now, if you feel that the journal is taking a bit too much time in the peer review process, please do email the editor and say, I'm on a bit of a deadline here because of X reason. Can you tell me where it is? And usually editors, they're very good. They'll come back and say, okay, let's see what we can do. You know, your paper is in this position in the peer review process. But basically, 1 paper, 1 journal until the very end. This is data fabrication. So this is an example. So these are 3 photos from 3 separate journals by the same author, and there's no cross-referencing between these 3 papers, which is bad enough. But what the thing is, what you want to look at is this is from paper 1. Have a look at A. This is from paper 2. Suddenly there's a spot that's appeared that's not in A. And another spot has appeared that's not in B. This is the same paper again, and they flipped it. So this is basically a big no-no. This is someone's been playing with his data and saying, oh, if only I had those 2 blobs in A and B, it would be awesome. So he put 2 blobs in A and B. And this was found out because it's in 3 papers, 3 journals that were quite similar to each other. People started to notice. His papers were retracted. It didn't end well from him. So you get the data you get, look at your results and make sure that you can defend those results, but don't start messing with your results to make them appear better. This is just an example of an authorship issue. which happens a lot. So Journal X publishes a paper. Person Y happens to see his name on this paper. He emails the editor saying, I cannot defend this paper. I am not prepared to have my name on this paper. The dean of the school was informed, and they launched an investigation. Because remember, if you think about it, the editors and the reviewers are in no position to decide who is an author on a paper because they don't have access to your lab. They don't know how many people did what in your lab over 3 years. The only people that know that should be you, your co-authors. But in cases where there is an authorship dispute, in general, the dean of the school that the research has been published on, or if there has been a dean of research ethics or integration, they get involved and they investigate. And basically, in this case, the first author had forged some signatures. There was some issues about fabrication, falsification, and basically the paper was retracted. But the thing to look at is it took 8 months. And that's a very long time because you have the publisher involved, you have your dean involved, you have editors involved. It takes time to make sure you do good due process. And it's not really the way you want to start your career, being kind of dragged in front of a dean of anything to kind of defend why you did or didn't put someone on a paper. Ooh. So authorship disputes must be resolved by the authors. The editors can't adjudicate because they don't know who wrote what. It does delay publication because the second there is an ethical issue or there is an authorship issue, the papers are stalled. They're stopped in the production and they don't go anywhere until it's been cleared up. If a paper is published and an author has been added or has been forgotten, then you can correct the scientific literature by publishing a corrigendum or an erratum and linking the two papers together. But you can't just change the authorship list on a published paper. That paper stays as a discrete, unique object, and then you publish the corrigendum or an erratum and link them to the two of them together. So plagiarism. So all plagiarism is copying. It's basically taking someone else's words and trying to pass them out as your own. So what can be plagiarized? Anything can be plagiarized. Words, findings, graphs, illustrations. It's endless, the amount of things that can be plagiarized. And, you know, sometimes you read a sentence in an introduction and it's exactly what you want to say. You're like, oh, that's really, really good. I really want to use that. And, you know, it is an urge to do that, but you haven't said that. The other person says it. You can put that quote in quote marks and stick it into your introduction if you want to. But remember, your paper is your currency. You need to write it in your words. No one else should be doing your research for you, so no one else should be writing your paper for you. Be aware that when you submit your paper to a journal, it's probably going to be run against this software called Crosscheck, which is basically an anti-plagiarism software. So your paper is submitted to the journal. It's run through this software, which basically has the database from 83 publishers, so millions and millions of articles, and also against the open web. And then it will come back with a similarity index saying, it's found that 32% of this paper has been published in some way, shape, or form in other areas, either online or in this database. And then the editor goes in and sees where that 32% similarity is happening. Now, when I look at these things, if I see 32% up there, and I see that there's a whole big one area of 32%, so a whole 2 or 3 paragraphs from the results or discussion make up that 32%, okay, that's clear plagiarism. But if you see a lot of 32%'s 1%, then you have to take that into account because there's only so many ways you can write materials and methods sometimes. There's only, you will have common words if you're using, say, a readily known type of materials and methods. This software can't detect plagiarism. Only a person can detect plagiarism, which is why that editors will look at this kind of report and then make a decision. But it is a tool that they use on most papers, so be aware that when someone submits a paper, it will be run through this anti-plagiarism software. And then it's all very well me standing up here and talking about ethics and it has consequences, but unless you put actual numbers on it, it doesn't tend to stick. So basically, the most obvious thing when a paper has been found to be unethical is that there's reputational damage. For example, in some European countries, it's found that in a particular European country, a minister of government had plagiarized part of his PhD thesis many, many years ago, like 25 years ago, and had nothing to do with the current job he was doing in government. But because it was found that he had done this, his kind of reputation was called into disrepute, and he had to resign from his ministerial position. That 525 number is the cost of a single investigation into research malpractice in the US. So some university or some hospital or some institution spent that amount of money trying to figure out and fix or investigate a research malpractice. We talked about damaged reputations, retractions, and sale losses. So what happens when a paper is retracted? The paper still exists on the web. It's not taken away. But what happens is there's a big retraction text put across the PDF, and there's a retraction notice published next to the paper pointing out exactly why this paper has been retracted. So everything remains on the web. Everything is findable. So nothing goes away. It's always, always there. That 70,501 is the scariest number, because that is the number of patients that was treated using papers that were subsequently retracted for having the wrong materials and methods or the wrong results or the wrong dosage. That is very, very scary to me. You wouldn't want to be one of those patients. And that 110 million is the total cost of investigations into research misconduct in 2010. So there is money involved, there is reputational damage involved. So the best thing to do when you're starting out is to make sure you're just as ethical as possible. Everything is transparent. Everybody who should be on that paper is on that paper. You can replicate your materials and methods. Someone else can replicate your materials and methods. If you can tick all those boxes, you don't need to worry about the last 10 minutes of the presentation. But it's very good to know these things before you start, rather than finding out about them after they happen to you. So I have been chatting away now for a while. So we're nearly at the end. So basically, the things that to bear in mind is choose the right journal, have a look at your audience, have a look at your community. Who do you want to work with in the future? Where are they publishing? Let's have a look at that journal. Make sure your abstract is crystal clear. This is the first or second value proposition people make about you. Sometimes it's the only thing they can see before they click on the PDF or email you to ask for the PDF. Spend time on your results and your discussion. Those are your work. They're the ones that you want to get out there. Share your data and research. There's like loads of repositories around the place that you can put your raw data and link to it. You can get DOIs for it. It's very good to share and open up your data. Use easy to understand charts, and don't try to make charts too squashed or crowded. Remember your person who's got 30 minutes. You want to tell them a good story using good illustrations, and use clear and correct manuscript language. So that's the end. Kamsahamnida. I hope it's been of some use to you. I know there's a lot of information and I've been speaking quite fast, but this is the kind of thing that I'm quite interested in, because the sooner people get some hints and tips about the research process, about publishing the paper, the easier it is for them on their journey towards publishing papers. So if you go to thepublishingcampus.com, variations of this presentation on there. There's also other hints and tips like grant writing and how to be a reviewer, and kind of, thoughts from editors and reviewers. If you take a long train home, this might be something to pass the first 20 minutes before you start streaming from Netflix or something. But anyway, thank you very much for everything. That's the end of my presentation. And if anybody has any questions, now is a good time for them. So thank you very much, everybody. Anybody who wants to ask me a question one-on-one, that's absolutely fine. I'll give emails to various people. So thank you very much. I hope to see you again.